Hi, I am Conor Friedersdorf.
And I'm Noah Millman. But Conor, who are you?
I am a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine, and who are you, Noah?
I am a blogger and contributor at, or actually I don't know, is contributor a technical term? If it's a technical term, I'm not it. I'm a blogger for the American Conservative.
Yeah, you write things there.
I write things there, and sometimes they publish them.
Yes.
Sometimes they just appear, and then nobody sees them.
So let's talk. Let's start by talking about contraception, the big controversy of the moment. Of course,
if you believe that.
Well, yes, I do believe it is the big controversy of the moment. I think that. So a little bit of background for viewers unfamiliar with this: the Obama administration and the Catholic Church got into a little back and forth that most of the conservative movement joined in. Regarding whether employers, specifically religious employers, should be required to provide health care to their employees that covers contraception. And the Catholic Church would have been forced to do this even for its teaching the hospitals and other sort of nonprofit arms. It is, as I understand it, exempt for actual church employees.
Right. I mean, this is part of, right, the larger context of this, right, is the, under the new healthcare regime, defining what sort of meets federal criteria of a sort of a standard package that an employer must provide, which is something that a variety of states used to do, and now the federal government's doing it and going through those questions of what has to be in and what doesn't have to be in and how much has to be covered and so forth. And so contraception was one of those items on the list.
Right. And as I understand it, actually, contraception, there have been like Equal Opportunity Employment Commission decisions about contraception, finding that if you cover prescription drugs, including Viagra, then you're obligated to cover contraception.
Right.
Or else you're guilty of sex discrimination.
Yep.
Which actually seems strange to me because I don't think of birth control and Viagra as equivalent things.
I would say the logic is that they're analogous in that neither one is actually a treatment in general, although there are exceptions in both cases, for a disease, and would be more accurately described as a sort of a medicine that you, or a product that you take to improve the function of your life from a biological perspective, right? I mean, you could say that about a lot of medical treatments, actually, right? I had an ACL replacement 2 years ago, and that was covered by my insurance, but a torn ACL is not a disease, and in fact, I was capable of ambulating without it. So, like, getting it repaired meant, oh, maybe I'll be able to do certain activities that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But I wasn't unable to work. I wasn't able to walk. I wasn't in constant pain, right? So there's, like, if you want to take a strict view of, like, only things that, you know, are treatments or cures for diseases or profoundly negative conditions of one sort or another, are healthcare, you know, then lots of stuff that we think of as healthcare doesn't fit the bill.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right, and I see the argument for treating them as analogous goods. I think the counter argument is that one, Viagra or a knee operation or whatever is something that happens when something has gone wrong with your body, something
not necessarily. And a lot of people take Viagra just because they're old. That's just like fighting the natural progression of life for a lot of people. I mean, you're right. There are people who take Viagra specifically because they have a particular impairment, but there are also a lot of people who get it just because of, you know, age-related, reduced. What's the word? What's a delicate word?
Right, but getting old, right, is, I mean, we treat most things that could be termed getting old as malfunctions with the body, right? I mean, your heart gives out sort of because you're just getting old, but it's also a malfunction with the body. I think it's different than Well, and this is the other difference.
I mean, like it seems to me that the argument cuts the other way, right? Better, right? In that, like, Viagra, again, like there are circumstances where you'd say where there are exceptions, but in general, right, it's a pure sort of, oh, I would like to do this thing that I have difficulty doing without this drug, right?
Right. I mean, it seems
whereas contraception relates to sort of fairly significant life consequences, right? If you can't,
yes, it does.
Right, if you're in the category of people who can't afford it and you want to have, then having a normal sex life could have profoundly deleterious consequences to you, right?
I'm not.
Depending on your situation, right? There's lots and lots of situations in the world.
Sure, depending on your situation.
Right.
Depending on your situation, that's true. And I guess before we go forward, another distinction I think it's useful to draw is that contraception also seems like less clearly something that should be dealt with through insurance to me.
Right. Like a lot of things that we do through insurance. Right.
Yeah,
it
is like a lot of things that we do through
insurance. There's a huge, vast category of things where insurance functions basically as a redistribution mechanism of one sort or another, so that people get the sort of care that theoretically they could pay out of pocket for if they were able to plan appropriately for it. But we do it through the insurance system. We could do it another way.
Right.
Nobody actually really does.
Yes.
But I mean, in most countries, right, most developed countries anyway, right, you've got some form of more or less universal health care, and these things, a lot of the things we're talking about are of these kinds of services we're talking about are free. Indeed, there's a good argument for making some of them cheaper than free, right? Vaccinations, right, are things you could pay for out of pocket. They're not actually very expensive. And you could subsidize it for poor people and structure your healthcare system that way. So there's actually a very strong argument that things like that you should make cheaper than free and bring them to the people and absorb the expense of not only the drug but the distribution to the home and have roving vans going around, because the benefit to society of having the treatment used is sufficiently large.
Yes, and generally, I guess my larger take on this, I'm generally pro-contraception, pro-availability of contraception. I'm okay with subsidizing it for people who can't afford it. I'd like it to be widely available, and, if I had my way, I would probably do away with the requirement to actually see a doctor and get a prescription for it. I wouldn't mind if people could visit the pharmacist and read a label and make sure they're not taking other medicines that would do harm to them and then get it without a prescription. Mm-hmm. But I would like to separate it from both the insurance function and the employer function for different reasons. And I think this is part of why this fight is a big thing right now. Most people don't actually have a moral objection to contraception, but I think that this is sort of highlighting the way that both employer-sponsored healthcare and Obamacare generally are coercive. And it's sort of inevitable that they're going to be coercive in certain ways, that they're going to force certain employers who object to things, whether for religious reasons or cost reasons, to sort of do things they don't want to do. Mm-hmm. And to me, this is avoidable. You could actually do this in a way that didn't implicate employers at all and have the same end goods and not be coercive. And
right.
To me,
so
that would be a good thing.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think President Obama agrees with you, right? He said that at one time during the healthcare debate, if we were designing the health system, de novo, from the ground up, right, mm-hmm. he'd favor single-payer healthcare because it's cleaner and cheaper and, very straightforward.
Right.
So, and he didn't go that way basically for political reasons and as well as for economic reasons, the political reasons being like the more you're changing the system, the more entrenched interests you have to take on. Whereas
Right.
if you build incrementally on whatever already exists, then you have to take on fewer entrenched interests, or you have more opportunities to co-opt those interests, which I think is basically the way he approached it. And the economic reason being, like, if you enact a wholesale, big change that creates a lot of uncertainty, and you don't know what the economic consequences of the transition are going to be, even if you project that the end state is going to be better, why throw all those other variables into the mix? So we built on the system we already had. The system we already had, most people get their health insurance through their employer. And yeah, if you want to build a universal system, or almost universal system, on the backs of the expectation that for a considerable period of time, although it may change over time, and I think the expectation is that it will change over time, but if you expect for a good long time, most people are going to get their insurance through employers, and you want that insurance to be basically universal, and you want there to be rules, it's going to be coercive. You're effectively, forcing private actors to act as agents of the state, because the state's the one saying, we think everybody in this society deserves such and such package of, and that's true with whatever the employer thinks, right? Like, I actually don't personally think that the controversy here is that real. I'll be honest. I think this is a manufactured controversy mostly. And the best evidence for that is that the compromise that the Obama administration came up with is a shell game. And everybody understands that it's a shell game, right? The church, the Catholic Church will basically say we're not willing to pay for contraception, and the insurance company is mandated to say, okay, well, we're not going to charge you anything for the contraception. We're just going to include it as a freebie, so you're not paying for it, right? So that's a shell game. Either it really is free, right, in which case this whole thing has been about nothing from the beginning, or it really isn't free, in which case other people are basically paying for that mandate, and it's invisible. But either way, nothing's changing from what the original decision was, and that was a compromise that was acceptable to Catholic hospitals. Has not been acceptable to the bishops, but I don't think their objection is, Obamacare is coercive. I think the objection, and I don't think the objection is really a religious freedom objection. I have a problem with using freedom as really what the issue is here. I think the issue is that the federal government is now basically saying this is the universal norm in the United States, right? If you object to this, it's some weird, quirky thing that you've got, like Jews don't eat pork and Mormons don't drink coffee, and whatever. You've got your own weird thing about this, and that's fine. You are free to have your own weird thing about whatever you want, because it's a free country. But this is normal, right? There's not not a moral vision of the way all of society should run that we respect, that we say, no, that's actually should be competing in the public square for attention, and we want institutions that put forth that to be allowed to manifest that through their the way they treat non-co-religionists. That, I think, is the issue, really.
Well, I think for the Catholic bishops, that is certainly part of the issue. I don't think, though, that this is a manufactured controversy, actually. And I've talked. I generally post my articles to Facebook, and because I went to 13 years of Catholic school, I've heard from a lot of people about this particular topic, and I've heard from a lot of lay Catholics, almost all of whom are perfectly fine using contraception. Who pretty strenuously object to this. I think one reason that they object to it, actually, which I haven't seen get a lot of attention, they object to the idea that Catholic hospitals and other Catholic nonprofits are somehow treated differently than the church itself, than, an employee of the local parish, for example. And they're uncomfortable with the idea.
Do they really think that? For example, no, let me press on that.
They're uncomfortable.
Let me press on that, right? The Catholic Church is perfectly free to say we're not going to hire women as priests under any circumstances.
Right.
Right? They're free to make all sorts of tests and rules about what you believe and how you comport yourself. They're free to tell certain categories of employees that they're not allowed to have sex with anybody if they want to keep their job. Right?
Right. Yes.
They don't believe that the Catholic Church should be allowed to run a hospital and impose those sorts of rules on employees. Right? They don't think that the standard's the same. They recognize there is a difference between running something that is service, and it's a religious service, right? I think the Obama administration's the language they use suggesting that, like, these aren't religious things that the church is doing, I think is what created all the offense, right?
Right, yeah, yeah.
Running a hospital is a service, right? It is a service that you're doing out of religious motive. It is a service to God from the perspectives of the people who are sponsoring it, from the perspectives of the people who give of their time and their money and their energy to create these institutions. It's absurd to draw that particular line. But,
well, I don't know.
But there is a difference between what those employees are and what employees fulfilling a church function are.
I think the distinction that most Catholics I know would draw, for example, at a parish where they agree that the church should be able to, have gender discrimination in employing priests, right? I don't think that even at a parish they think that the church should be allowed to have gender discrimination in choosing, the person who sings at Mass every Sunday or other non-clerical roles.
But Orthodox Jewish organizations do that all the time, right? So if you go to a shul in an Orthodox synagogue anywhere, right, they will not let a woman sing, right? Because for a variety of different reasons, there are certain categories of things where it's just sort of not done, and there are other categories of things where there's a more detailed explanation for why a woman doesn't count. I happen to belong to a conservative synagogue where women can do whatever men do, but in Orthodox synagogues that's not true, and that's an imposition on the laity, right? You're allowed to do that sort of stuff if you're a religious institution with respect to, the religious, sacramental functions, let's say, of that institution. I think that's
certainly, justified or not, the objection. This objection is real. This is what a lot of Catholics I know think is somehow this controversy is saying that what you do at a Catholic hospital, what you do at a Catholic university, that isn't really a religious thing. That's just like a second.
Right. I agree with you. I think that was profoundly offensive language and very stupid language for the administration to use. But on a substantive level, I think it's a manufactured controversy. Right.
Well, I don't
think they had. I think that they could have. Ultimately, this compromise effectively is the same rule without that language. Right.
I just don't think that you can. I don't think it's a useful distinction to say on a substantive level something is a manufactured controversy. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the Catholic position on contraception is wrongheaded generally, but the whole point of being coercive is like they feel differently.
What I'm saying is I'm distinguishing between a controversy about the way something was said and a controversy about what was actually being enacted. Right.
Oh, I see.
To the extent that there's a controversy about what was actually being enacted, right, it seems to me, right, if you extend the principle of, first of all, it's not clear to me why, if the issue is conscience, right, hold on just 1 second, switch phones.
Yeah.
That one's battery is dying. If the issue is conscience, right, then I don't understand why churches are special, right? If you are a religious believer, and you have a business, a for-profit business, right? Why are you compelled by the state to give your employees something that you think is evil, that is doing wrong, right?
Right.
And so if you extended that to sort of other areas, right, outside of healthcare, it would become clear that, well, you couldn't let everybody opt out of everything that they think is wrong, right? So that's why I said I think it boils down to a kind of, do we think, are we as a society going to say, now this particular issue we don't agree with the Catholic Church about, but we respect that this is not just a quirk, right? This is not just, okay, we've got our rules, right? We don't serve, the Muslim institution, we don't serve alcohol, right?
Right.
We've got this is part of a profound moral vision that society should respect, right? And I think the church has a point when they say that that's what's, that we need to be allowed to do that, and we need to be able to express that through all of what we do, and not just through, at Mass. But when you phrase it that way, I think it becomes clear that this isn't really about liberty and coercion. It's about the presence and what the boundaries are of that presence of a religious witness in social life more generally. I happen to think you can set those boundaries a little further. I think, like, the assumption that, like, there's something terrible that happens if you allow that to happen at all is wrong. But I think phrasing it as liberty makes it sound like, oh, well, of course, to be true to the First Amendment, you can't ever let a church, you can't ever tell a church you've got to do something you don't believe in. And people should think a little bit, because if that's what they really think, that principle could extend astonishingly far.
Well, sure, but I agree with you. I think that is true of most principles that we hold dear. We balance them against one another all the time. And so in that sense, this is no different. We should probably move on because at 20 minutes or so. So tell me, you've just recently started posting regularly at the American Conservative.
Yeah.
So what are you, Noah Millman, doing at the American Conservative?
Well, they pay me, so I write for them. No, the simple answer that I wrote, the first blog post I wrote for them, kind of answers that question. But I am not there because of a sort of deep ideological affinity for where they're coming from, and I think that they're in the process of some transition about what that is. The vision that was articulated to me by them is that they're not really trying to be an ideologically coherent place. They do have sort of a center and a periphery. They're very clearly staking out a place on the what you might call sort of the anti-imperialist right. That's their center. But beyond that, I think they're trying to be open to an expansive intellectual conversation across a variety of topics. And I think there should be more of that generally. I think it's really hard to do that successfully and keep an audience. I think most audiences want to hear what they already know and what they already think. And it's particularly hard to get a diverse group of people together who are going to disagree with each other and on a regular basis and get a lot, and disagree sometimes on very fundamental things. So I sort of applaud what they're doing with their space, and I hope they succeed. And they said I can say what I want. Right. Even if I think the Obama administration is, like, not satanic, even though I think the contraception issue is something of a manufactured controversy.
Right. And how has the reception been? Do you have comments on your blog? I can't remember.
Yeah, I do.
And how are you being received? Are people open to a voice outside of what they regularly publish?
I don't know, really. I'll be honest. I don't know what my statistics are at this point. And comments are not necessarily a great representative slice of anything. Some of the people who have been reading me for a long time at the American scene moved over. I think some of their regular readers will not probably read me because I basically announced, hey, I'm going to be disagreeing with you on a whole bunch of stuff. Right. So if they're not interested in being disagreed with, they probably won't read me. I don't know. We'll find out. I'll learn that I'm going to be more interested to see whether sort of the rest of the world takes notice, not just of me, but of the magazine more generally over time. Whether it's recognized as a group of people that you need to reckon with one way or another. Not in the sense that, we have power, but in the sense that, it behooves people to pay attention to them because they're saying interesting things and unexpected things. So we'll see.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one thing...
But there's another reason, actually, I should say, that I'm there, and that's that the sorting that has gone on of people into camps politically and culturally, I think has gone ludicrously overboard in this country. And so maybe it's perverse on my part, but I sort of actively want to join a club that you wouldn't think would want me as a member.
Right. Yeah. Well, I certainly understand that impulse, and I've been glad to see you and Roger as well go there recently, and I continue to read Daniel Larison as well. I would say that you three are my most regular reads, and I check out Dan McCarthy stuff sometimes and others as well. One thing that interests me about AmCon, and one reason why I think that there's good reason to think the rest of the world might take more notice of it, is that there is this big argument going on the right that sort of is tamped down sometimes and pops up sometimes about what is the conservative approach to foreign policy. And various writers at AmCon disagree about a lot of things. You and Roger and Daniel Larson are an example of people who have all sorts of very different views about various subjects. One thing you all have in common is at least an openness to pretty radical critiques of U.S. foreign policy. It's not to say you all come down in the same place, but certainly compared to the sort of conversation you see in presidential debates, for example, it's open to the critique that we have just, I guess, open to the critique that the United States has done immoral things in the rest of the world that it should stop doing. And also a more pragmatic critique that says, we can't go on doing what we're doing forever. Maybe the degree to which we're willing to intervene in the world is counterproductive rather than necessary. I'm curious to see how this is all going to play out, because a fascinating thing about the GOP primary this year has been that President Bush has gone almost entirely unmentioned, and the war in Iraq has gone mostly unmentioned. Rick Santorum is probably the candidate who is most willing to defend the Bush administration's foreign policy, although he isn't.
He's not willing to defend the Bush administration's foreign policy because he doesn't think it went far enough.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And I think Gingrich's critique is fairly similar. Well, I mean, not as strident and consistently so as Santorum's is, but I don't think he's shown any interest in taking the American conservative view of things seriously, to the extent that there is a view. I should say, Larison, I think, is not open to a radical critique. He is promulgating a radical critique.
Yes.
Right? He is making a radical critique of American foreign policy, a very radical one.
Absolutely right.
I would describe myself as open to it. I think that it's actually been very instructive to me, even if I disagree with people like Larison or Andrew Basovich or whoever, to reckon with those arguments. And it's notable that, again, in a kind of breaking bounds sort of way, there's an openness on their part to arguments that come historically from the radical left. Basovich wrote the introduction to William Appleman Williams's when his book was reissued, and I think it's called "Empire is a Way of Life." Mm-hmm. There's sort of a recognition that this question kind of doesn't fit neatly into not only the boxes that we have right now, but the boxes that we've had for a long time in terms of thinking of what's right-wing and what's left-wing.
Mm-hmm. And this is the fascinating thing to me about, if you look at opinion polls, there are a lot of rank-and-file Republicans who are averse to sending the American military to any other country, who are averse to quote-unquote nation-building, who would like a more non-interventionist foreign policy. Probably wouldn't go as far as...
That includes people who are in the military, and Ron Paul has gotten a substantial amount of support from active service members.
And as yet, this hasn't been reflected in the Republican Party. There's been no candidate that has tried to champion these things other than Ron Paul. And I would argue that he isn't even quite representative of these people, because he's making a much more radical critique than they're inclined to make. I wrote something about this a little while ago that I think at this point, I think foreign policy is basically just a branch of the culture war. That it's used from political perspective as a way of sort of lining people up where they're supposed to be. So if you look at Romney's foreign policy argument, right, there isn't one. Right, Romney's foreign policy argument is Obama's not a real American. He doesn't really believe in America. Right, there isn't a substantive argument there at all. He'll try to fit one or another action of the administration into that template if he can, and if he can't, he just sort of says it without trying to fit any action into it. That being the case, right, and Santorum's foreign policy, right, is a kind of gut instinct sort of thing, right? Anybody who's in any way threatening in any dimension, right, must be obliterated. It's not... Nobody's discussing foreign policy, from the perspective of interests. Nobody's talking about it saying, well, really we should be focused on this rather than that, or really this is, we're spending too much on this and we should be spending more on that, or even, well, if we, want to achieve these goals over the long term, we should shift our, nobody's talking about how we should deal with the evolution of Europe. Nobody's talking in any substantive way about, what, is likely to happen in China and India, in the next, 20, 30 years, or what we need to be prepared for, for that. From a foreign policy perspective, right? It's all a kind of let's line up with the team kind of rhetoric. There was a very unusual moment in one of the GOP debates, and the subject was Pakistan, and there were most of the candidates on stage were having a typically hawkish line on Pakistan, and Michelle Bachmann and Rick Santorum, I think I'm remembering this correctly, it was the two of them who sort of said, wait a minute, we kind of actually know something about Pakistan, and what you're saying clearly isn't viable. They're a nuclear power, and destabilizing them would be catastrophic. And suddenly it was this sort of out of nowhere, very realist critique, where it was like,
I wouldn't dignify by calling that a critique. I would call it like sort of a moment of reality.
Sure,
Right?
a moment of reality. But it was such a striking moment of reality because of all the other things that they say are so divorced from reality. And to me, I thought to myself, wait, so when you know about things, you actually are grounded in reality? Is it just that you don't know about all of these other things? I didn't understand. I sort of always assumed that their rhetoric was mostly a put-on. And after that, I thought,
well,
maybe they're being
saying
earnest
that it's not motivated by reality is not saying the same thing as it's a put-on, right? I mean, you know, attitudes that are not based in reality can actually affect reality. You know, you can wind up going to war because you think that, you know, X is true and X has no bearing on reality, but the war then actually happens.
Right.
You know, that is to some extent an open question with Mitt Romney, of whether sort of there's anything behind, you know, any of what he's saying, or whether, you know, from his perspective, this is all sort of contentless advertising for himself.
Mitt Romney's foreign policy remarks strike me as just totally, totally cynical politics. I actually don't think that what the Republicans are doing is going to work on Obama, and I don't understand why they think it will work. I mean, there's certainly actual critiques one could make of the Obama foreign policy that would appeal to the general electorate, even to the Republican electorate. But they've sort of gone out of their way to just say, well, he doesn't believe in American exceptionalism, and he's going around the world on an apology tour and bowing to our enemies and guilty of appeasement. And it seems to me that they're putting themselves in a position where they're going to square off in a presidential debate, and Obama's going to go through a little checklist of all of the terrorists that he's killed in the Bin Laden raid and some of the raids on pirates, and he's going to talk about some modest achievements in various places in the world. And polling data suggests to me that most people kind of buy into the idea that he is at least willing to use force and isn't actually, you know, an anti-American appeaser or a Kenyan anti-colonialist, as Newt Gingrich would put it. I'm just puzzled.
But
why...
to my mind, it's the same. Here's the way I would look at it. This stuff is no different from the, you know, he's a socialist, Marxist, you know, whatever, out to, you know, destroy the historic American, you know, free enterprise system. You know, all of this is designed to make politicians' jobs easier. And folks on the left do this as well. They don't do it as with the stridency that the GOP has done recently. You know, but if you go back, you know, to, well, I don't know, you know, the early 90s or something, there's things were probably more parallel in terms of how much of this stuff went on in both parties, and some of it still, plenty of it still goes on, you know, on the left, if you can get people to line up on your team by saying you are our sort of people and they are the other sort of people, then you don't have to articulate how you were going to actually solve their problems. You don't have to actually materially improve their interests, right? You can convince them that they have to vote for you, because if they don't vote for you, the bad guys will get in, and you know, and that is, you know, obviously totally unacceptable. You know, then your life will be over. So don't worry about, you know, the specifics of how your interests are going to be treated here. So there's an incentive to turn discussions about taxes into, you know, what amount to culture war arguments. There's an incentive to turn foreign policy into what amount to culture war arguments. Because if it does work, most of the time, you know, then your job has become very, very easy as a politician and as a if you actually, you know, get into government. And then the second piece I would say to that cynical worldview is that elections mostly are going to turn on fundamentals. So most of what's going to determine whether Obama gets reelected or not is whether people, the median voter, thinks that the economy is improving or not. If the median voter thinks the economy is improving and improving sufficiently rapidly, they'll probably vote to reelect the president. If the median voter doesn't think that, or thinks strongly the opposite, rather, that the economy is getting worse, they'll probably punish the incumbent. And on the foreign policy side, it's also not that different, right? If we're engaged in a war that appears to be failing, when we're suffering defeats, that will have one impact. If we appear to be, winning victories or, not engaged in conflict, then that'll have the opposite impact. I think war and peace, usually matter less than the economy in elections, but sometimes they matter a lot.
It seems to me that this critique of the opposing candidate as a radical, as vote for your team or you're dead, as you put it. I don't think that can work nearly as well on an incumbent president. I think that the evidence is just there that shows that he is not a foreign policy radical in the way that conservatives mean it. And to me, the Bush administration, in 2004, I think that President Bush was theoretically beatable, just as I think that President Obama is theoretically beatable in this upcoming election. I think that one thing that is going to end up having helped both of them is the sort of overheated critique of the other side. It seems to me that
you think that John Kerry made an overheated critique of President Bush?
No, I think that the left generally made an overheated critique of President Bush. And what I mean by that, I think that a lot of the left's critique of President Bush was dead on and should have been listened to. For example, I don't think that we should have gone into Iraq, and I'm outspoken in my opposition to a lot of the civil liberties abrogations. At the same time, I think that there's a certain amount of sort of bandwidth out there. There's a certain amount that people are going to pay attention to critiques of the president, and the most sort of loud, extreme critiques are often going to be the ones that get picked up and that people see, on the front page of the newspaper or see in the soundbite on the news, on television. And when those critiques are Bush is just like Hitler or Obama is a Kenyan anti-colonialist appeaser, it's easy to dismiss those things and just sort of not be paying that much attention, but sort of hear these critiques and think, well, this doesn't really square with reality. I can't believe that's true. And to not really delve into it and just dismiss broader critiques too. It seems to me that you don't.
I feel like that's always been true, though, right? There's always been a fringe, and there's always been crazy people, and there's always been deliberate use of fringe crazy elements to, get people excited.
But the fringe
look at some of the stuff that was thrown out in the election of 1824 or 1884 or whatever. Like, there was some bad stuff said in the past.
Well, yes, but in living memory, right? It has been the case. It has been the case that changes in the media.
Look at what people said about Nixon. They said some very nasty things about him. Some of them turned out to be true. But I mean, like,
to me, though, the way that people get their news now, the rise of cable news, of talk radio, of bloggers, it's such that critiques that you normally would not have associated with the mainstream of the opposition, now these radical critiques are associated with the mainstream of the opposition. I think that people said nasty things about.
Yeah, I still think the reason for this.
Nixon.
I still think the reason for this is, maybe I'm being too much of a materialist, but I still think that the overwhelming reason for this, is that the really driving problems that people are really worried about feel intractable, and both parties still need to get everybody to show up at the polls and vote for them, even though they're dealing with what amount to intractable problems, and don't have really obvious solutions to them.
I think that's right.
For example, a symptom of and it's gotten to the point that even sort of people who analyze these problems are starting to analyze them without really remembering the difference between things that have a material impact and things that are sort of cultural epiphenomena. And I haven't read the book yet, but Charles Murray's new book is, from the way it's been described, sounds like a really good example of what I'm talking about. Have you read it yet? Or are you planning?
I haven't. I've read like 3 of his sort of op-ed length outtakes, and I've taken his "How Thick Is Your Bubble" quiz. And
my bubble is very thick.
And I even read a piece that defined me as the upper class elite that is ruling America. So I'm familiar with it, but I've not read the whole book.
So, I mean, I haven't read it either, right? I've read snippets that have been excerpted, and I've read a variety of articles about it, some things praising it, some things damning it. I read David Fromm's attack on it. But one of the things that came out really strongly from the quiz, and it also came out from the way people talk about it, is the degree to which the divide that we're talking about amounts to things like dietary habits and choices of recreation.
Right.
And,
do you drink Budweiser or a fancy microbrew?
Things that have, if what you're talking about is, why should you trust the other person, right? Which is what ultimately we're talking about here, right? Do you trust, should people in the bubble trust the people out of the bubble and vice versa, right? This stuff shouldn't matter. I mean, I don't know why it should matter whether you are, a beer snob or whether you are or whether you're a reverse beer snob, why that should have any significance to whether I trust you to do my taxes right. Why that should have any significance. Like, if you think about it, like, okay, would I trust my doctor, if I knew that he drank wine? Right? Like, the question just seems stupid. And yet, right, when we talk about politics, it seems perfectly natural for us to say, oh, well, I wouldn't, he's obviously on that team, because he eats pork rinds, or he's obviously on that team because he eats brie. Once upon a time, I think it was Sergeant Schreiber, campaigning and went into a working class bar, and ordered like some French cognac, as his drink, right? And it wasn't a political issue, right? This was cited in an article. I'm trying to remember what article it was, as like sort of how things have changed, right? This was a guy who felt like, that I'm a rich guy and I like good liquor and I can afford it, and I'm going to order one, and I'm going to be myself, and
and then in 2004, John Kerry was criticized for ordering provolone cheese on a Philly cheesesteak.
Right, because that was the proof that he wasn't a real man of the people. He didn't know what. I have no idea what cheese goes in a Philly cheesesteak.
Well, this one critique I have of Murray's argument, for, at least from the excerpts I've read, is this: that I understand, one way in which I exist in a bubble, right, is that I have not worked on a factory floor and gone home at the end of the day with like a part of my body hurting, right? This is one of the things that he mentions. And I see how this can be a salient thing of like, if no one in the quote unquote ruling class has this experience, that can matter in various ways. On the other hand, when I read his critique about, have you bought a domestic beer and stocked your refrigerator with it in the last year, right? I dissent from the idea
that Dogfish Head doesn't count.
Right. I dissent from the idea that I am the one living in a bubble here, right? Because I have drank quite a bit of Budweiser in my life. It is, in fact, the beer in my grandparents' fridge, but that isn't really relevant to my point. What I'm trying to say is that I've tried all of the domestic beers. I've tried Coors and Coors Light, and I've tried MGD, and, go down the list. I've drank it. I've also drank quite a few microbrews, and I think that the people that Charles Murray is talking about have not tried nearly as many beers as I have. Maybe this is for class reasons. Maybe they don't have the money to buy a fancy microbrew. Maybe it's because they like their Budweiser and don't feel the need to try anything else. But whatever the explanation, though, it isn't me that's living in a bubble. If anyone is living in a bubble, it's them that's living in a bubble on this single metric, right? And to me, some of his how thick is your bubble, they cut both ways. Sometimes I feel like, oh yeah, I'm the one in the bubble here. I'm the one who can't relate to this feature of American life. I've never vacationed in Branson, Missouri, and I probably never will unless I go there just to write an article about, like, what is this place Charles Murray is talking about.
Right.
But other things, I feel like the neighborhoods that I've lived in, for example, despite the fact that I've only lived on the American coasts, I've lived and traversed in a pretty diverse array of neighborhoods and come into contact with a lot of very different groups of people, both, like different ethnicities, different religious backgrounds, certainly far more so than if I spent my whole life living in a single exurb and driving to my factory job. And so I think his framing, his bubble framing, isn't really all of that accurate. I think it's more accurate to say that there is this separation, and I think this is actually what he's trying to argue, that there's this separation between the white working class and the people running the country. But I think his whole use of the bubble analogy really doesn't work for that reason.
I think it's got multiple problems with it because he's conflated so many different things, right? The fact that on the one hand he can say, hey, one of the interesting things about this divide is that the wealthier half of the country is more religious, than the less wealthy half of the country. The fact that he can sort of look at that and say, the fact that he can even talk about sort of what it amounts to sort of half of the country, right? And sort of describe these aggregate characteristics in terms of family stability, which is much higher. There's a whole long list of social ills that are much less prevalent, and then flip around to these sort of cultural markers and sort of, suddenly he's talking about, who lives in college towns, or who lives in, major urban centers, right? My uncle's fridge is, stocked with, Budweiser. He lives in, near Atlantic City.
Right.
He votes Republican. But he's one of the people running the country, right? Because he's in a certain income bracket, right? It just doesn't. The things he's the minority tastes that he's identifying as being sort of in one cultural group don't line up particularly well with the sociological characteristics that he's identifying with sort of the healthier half, let's say,
right?
The socially healthier half of the country. Where those cultural things do seem to line up is in the way we divide ourselves politically, which is increasingly tribal in character. And I think, again, this is, when I sort of, I think the analogy that I make in my own mind is to, places like, obviously it's not really a true analogy, it's a hyperbolic analogy, but, to places like Iraq or Lebanon, or if you want to pick a friendlier example, pick some other, Belgium or Canada, places where you have a profound cultural division that that drives politics, right? And people vote for their team. People, identify with people who have a shared cultural experience, right? To my mind, the main purpose of a politics like that, right, or the reason a politics like that develops is because the institutions that would otherwise enable people to organize for their own self-interest are either decayed or corrupted or haven't been built yet, or what have you. And I think to some extent all of that is true in all of those decayed, corrupted, and not built yet are to some extent true in the United States today. It strikes me as pathetic that where Murray goes with this is to say, people who are successful should hang out more with, people who are less successful, because that will be edifying. That there's just a total lack of interaction with the possibility that there may be a material basis for the difference in these sociological factors that he identifies that you might want to address.
Now, to me, in the current race, to me, Newt Gingrich is the clear candidate of tribalism. He's the guy who, on paper, doesn't make any sense for Tea Partiers to support. Having been a lobbyist, having supported everything the Tea Party supposedly hated about the Bush administration, but he certainly fits with, he certainly plays to their tribalism better than anyone. And I think you've seen him winning in the South, maybe because that is the region of the country where the tribalism is the strongest. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if I agree with the idea that that our politics is organized completely into like people whose cultural experiences are shared. Maybe this is because I grew up in and spent a lot of time recording in two different areas of red California, where places that are always sending Republicans to Congress and always voting for Republican governors and always voting for Republican presidents, even in landslide Democratic wins. To me, the people in the Inland Empire, the people in Orange County, California, even the farmers in the Central Valley of California, for one, they don't have very much in common with each other. Orange County Republicans and Central Valley Republicans, to me, don't have that much in common with each other. They certainly don't have anything in common with Alabama Republicans or Mississippi Republicans. In fact, I think if you put them all in the same state together, they would divide into totally separate political parties.
I think there are people.
Created a society with the two.
There was a book recently about the evolution of California politics. I don't remember what the title was, but that traces the origin of Southern California conservatism actually to the Okie migration. So there may be an argument that at least Central Valley, or Inland Empire Republicans do have something in common with, if not Republicans in Alabama, Republicans in the Appalachians, the Scots-Irish Appalachian spine of the country, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, West Virginia, whatever, that kind of cultural milieu. So
there's an interesting, I think it's a Washington Monthly article that sort of carves up the United States into different regions, and it's pretty interesting. I think it's titled "What the Tea Party Can Learn About Geography," something like that. But it would carve Southern California into a region with Arizona and Nevada, and carve Northern California into a sort of greater Pacific Northwest.
Yeah. Okay.
and it actually carves up the rest of the country in lots of interesting ways that that I remember as being persuasive, but can't remember at all. So maybe it wasn't that persuasive. But yeah, I don't know.
There was George Kennan, who Daniel Anderson admires, actually quite seriously late in life made the argument that the United States should be literally carved up in some such fashion. That basically Madison was wrong, or Hamilton. I forget who wrote the relevant Federalist that I'm thinking of. It's number 10 that talks about sort of how a large republic is actually going to be stabler than a small republic. But in any event, he was basically arguing that they're wrong, that the United States has actually gotten too large, unwieldy, and that it's no longer possible to maintain the kind of Republican virtue that we once had in the scale of country that we have. The center is just inevitably too far from the people. It's not a completely absurd argument.
No, it's not. It's not completely absurd. I think the people of the United States benefit pretty tremendously from the ability to move anywhere within the 50 states, and I guess how I think a carved up nation would work out probably has a lot to do with how free immigration was. But I think that there is this way in which the United States and economic trends here are totally destructive of the sort of Republican virtue and localism that I associate with Roger a little bit, and with Front Porch Republic, and it's just it's too easy for people to self-sort into the sort of place they want to live, to also maintain lots of different people sticking around a community and making it work. It is a bad thing in some ways for all the people who are interested in journalism to move to New York and Washington, D.C., even if it's a good thing for those people. And I don't really know how to make the trade-off between the interests of those people and the interests of communities. I'm sympathetic to the localism of the Front Porch Republic types, and yet I've moved all around the country. I suppose I've returned to California, but
Saul
Olinsky's
answer to your question, right? Right, would be that you need what amount to a class of professional organizers. You need people who see it as their mission to go forth and help create organs of local representation, is what he's really talking about, to capture power. And it's sort of interesting the way Obama was a pretty lousy community organizer, which I think is sort of more telling than the fact that he was a community organizer. But it's sort of interesting that the way that became sort of an epithet, sort of a joke line, in the 2008 election, and I presumably will still be, probably still is, I don't know, because those very techniques are ones, the same techniques we're talking about are ones that the right, and particularly the religious right, used very successfully in the 70s and 80s and continues to use today. I mean, the huge change that happened to the Republican Party since the 70s, and the huge change that happened to American politics since is the degree of political organization organized around not necessarily church affiliated, but in some cases, church affiliated, but around the religious rights issues.
Right, it's Michelle Bachmann going and joining her school board, and then launching a political career from there.
And I think it's very telling, though, right, that sort of the interests, right, that we're organized around, right, are these cultural interests that you would think would be readily accommodatable. There shouldn't be, on some level, a culture war, right? I don't know what victory in a culture war could possibly look like. The culture war is, to my mind, from a political perspective, an arms race, right? It's mostly an enormous waste of energy. Because
yes, I agree with
what the law is and what is done and isn't done sort of follows a certain median, and that median is not dictated by political pressure primarily. It's primarily dictated by real aggregate preferences and real cultural change on the ground. So that's I guess what I'm getting at. That like when I look at American politics, I see a huge swath of it organized overwhelmingly around issues that are not really political issues, or not really what politics, when politics is healthy, should be organized around.
In fact, I would argue that a lot of politics is, it's not even organized around issues so much as a notion of who is being disrespected and who is being insulted, which really is puzzling to me. I think that the readiness with which certain conservatives are willing to see themselves as victims, it sort of astonishes me, because when I listen to the Mark Levin show or the Rush Limbaugh show, or when I watch Fox News,
among the ways that I'm in the bubble is that I have never listened to Mark Levin or Rush Limbaugh.
So you hear a lot of insults about liberals that you'd probably expect, even not having listened to these shows. Lots of harsh things are said, lots of stereotypes are thrown around, and yet there will be a turn in the show, and there'll be some news clip from some liberal out there in the world, and it can be a very marginal person. It'll be a sort of C-list celebrity like Janine Garofalo or something, right? And she'll say something nasty about conservatives. And there'll be an uproar. Oh my God, the cultural elite is insulting us again. Well, yeah, Janine Garofalo is insulting you, but, I mean, first, who cares that Janine Garofalo is insulting you? And second, you, Rush Limbaugh, have a much bigger audience than Janine Garofalo. You've just been insulting liberals. Should they feel put upon? Well, no. And
why, at the highest level, why are you organizing your political views around who you think is going to insult you, as opposed to who is going to actually promote your interests? Like that's to me the ultimate question. Look at something like the whole Komen Planned Parenthood brouhaha, which to my mind was a perfect example where both sides, right, where this is going to be great for politics for both sides, right, which shouldn't be possible, right? If politics is a zero-sum game, right? But when I say it's good for both sides, what it means is it will make it easier for both sides to get their people on side. They will be, it will cost less in the way of actually, achieving anything to get their people to vote for them because of this controversy, right? From the perspective of the Planned Parenthood partisans, right? A anti-abortion person took over Komen and turned it into a political, gave it a political edge that it was never intended to. It was intended to be nonpartisan and not to have opinions about things like abortion or not. And by saying, well, we're not going to fund Planned Parenthood anymore, they were clearly taking a line. And from the anti-abortion side, right, this looks like, look, they wanted to move to a neutral stance where they're not going to be involved in the controversy, right? Where previously they were funding Planned Parenthood, which was taking a side in the controversy, And look, the pro-choice side, won't tolerate that, for a minute, and they won't let anybody ever, it's like, the Brezhnev doctrine, once you've become part of the, pro-choice orbit, you're never allowed to leave. And, the significance for both sides, the actual significance is really, really small. It's a symbolic action in either case.
Right.
And it feels to both sides like that symbolism matters enormously, right? Like if the other side gains an inch, then, who knows where the next inch will go and the next inch will go. As if sort of this battle over the way Americans think about abortion is going to be won based on these kinds of bureaucratic fights, as opposed to based on how people actually live their lives and what becomes normal in people's actual experience, and therefore what they want to see tolerated and what they don't want to see tolerated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I actually understand why culture war issues are more... I guess I'm most sympathetic to people who get drawn into the culture war on issues like abortion and where they feel like there's something very important at stake and societal norms matter a great deal, and so they fight over what they see as symbolic normative fights, I guess. And I'm also sympathetic to, Rod Dreher, a recurring theme on his blog is sort of the United States is becoming less and less accommodating to religious minorities and their ability to live their lives as they see fit.
I don't think that's true at all.
Well, I don't think
see that. I mean, I have seen, and the examples that get brought up, right? Like, if you want to use sort of this contraception controversy as an example, right? I don't think it's a good example, right? Because it's not a story about are people allowed to live their lives the way they want.
Well, no, but it is a story about, if the Catholic Church wants to run certain kinds of nonprofits, then it is compelled to do things it doesn't want to do because the healthcare system has been federalized and we have picked one norm about what coverage should look like, and it isn't the norm that the Catholic Church would want. But
the world is
unreasonable. Well, so I think if you're someone like Rod, right, you look at that, and he homeschools. He and his wife homeschool their kids, for example,
which he's allowed to do.
Right. And I agree that
right. I mean, that's the assertion is like it's less tolerant of people living their lives the way they want to, right?
Right.
What I think is more true,
but it is the case, right? The logic of progressivism and a lot of the kinds of progressives who support Obama is to steadily impose various rules on things like homeschooling to guarantee what the progressives would say are, the rights of every kid to, it isn't that hard to imagine progressives arguing that every child has the human right to be educated about their bodies and about sex education and to try and impose a curriculum about that issue, right? Those are the kinds of things, I think, that someone like Rod would say, these are the kinds of concerns I have, that the more that the federal government grows in power, the more that decisions are made at the national level rather than the local level, the less people like me are able to carve out the kinds of lives that we want to live with our families.
An argument for sort of localism as such, right, is one that I can respect a lot. An argument for saying we've got to devolve power a lot, and if that means that the kooks in, Idaho and the kooks in Park Slope, Brooklyn, where I live, get more power and do kooky things. That's just the way we've just got to bite that particular bullet because federalizing everything turns everything into a battle. I can respect that argument a lot.
Uh-huh.
That's not the terms that the culture war is being fought on usually. I think Rod would be a rare example of somebody who would be very happy with that trade and say, yeah, no, that's totally cool with me. I'm very happy if my little local community is allowed to basically have more authority over all sorts of things. And I don't care if that also means that, you know, a community that takes the opposite side on all this stuff.
Yeah, I
agree.
I agree with you. I agree with you that Rod is a much more consistently willing to make that trade-off than a lot of conservatives. And I think, you know, someone like Rick Santorum, right,
is not
wants to get up and decry forcing the Catholic Church to do anything it doesn't want in sort of extremist language, you know, but has no problem forcing the Catholic Church to pay for to pay as taxpayers for the war in Iraq, which it had a conscientious objection to from the
first of all, the Catholic Church isn't a taxpayer, but more to the point, right? He's not at all somebody who thinks that the solution to a diversity of moral and cultural perspectives is what's the word? Devolution of authority down to the lowest,
right? Yeah, absolutely,
lowest plausible level, right? That is not at all where he's coming from.
No, not at all.
So
and I
think
wonder,
his perspective
actually,
is much more common. Honestly.
Yeah, I do too. Another thing that I wonder, another thing I think is driving the culture war is, and this is actually a solvable thing, is redistricting. It's redistricting in a way that puts partisans together and creates safe districts in a way that everything is fought in the primary and there's substantial agreement on most of the mainstream issues, and so it's.
I don't know. Has that changed much?
Culture warring one another.
I feel like that's been
has
true for a very long
redistricting changed
time.
Much?
I feel like that aspect of American politics has been true for a very long time.
I think seats have gotten increasingly safer over time.
I'm not sure that's true, but I'd be curious to see the data on that.
And it's pretty astonishing just looking at, comparing the level of approval for Congress with re-election rates.
We'll see. It will be very interesting this time, where you have the lowest approval rating in history for Congress. Yeah. Whether that translates into still very high re-elect rates. I suspect it won't. I suspect this will be an election where a lot of seats do turn over. But
do you imagine that it will turn over in any particular direction?
You want me to make a prediction now?
I mean, you seem to think that
I
do you think it advantages anyone?
If I felt like betting, which I don't, I would bet on a unified Democratic government in at the end of 2012.
Okay, and I guess maybe
that's driven basically by the fact that it's very, very simple. That while I think the Democrats will lose seats in the Senate, I think if the wind is at their backs a little bit, they probably won't lose enough for the chamber to flip. I think Obama will be reelected partly because of the disarray on the Republican side, but much more because I think the economic numbers are going to look sort of good enough, although not great. And obviously if that turns out not to be true, then this prediction is worth nothing. And I have a very hard time picturing that, without a Congress with a huge freshman class, to have, and freshmen are generally the most vulnerable to losing their seats, for it to have such a massive negative perception by the public, and to have to have those freshmen by and large reelected, seems really, really weird. And there would need to be a good explanation for that. I could imagine that explanation could be, well, Obama was lost in a landslide and people didn't split tickets and the Democrats were demoralized, so they didn't show up at the polls, and that's how Congress stayed in power. But if it looks like he's going to win, how do you get a negative 60% approval rating of Congress and have freshman who won a district that was previously for the other party with a high approval rating.
Right.
Those two things shouldn't go together.
Point, yeah. Yeah.
Whereas if you're in a safe seat, right, and you've been there 8 terms, you're probably going to get reelected again because that just is what usually happens.
So quickly, as we close out, I would say I'm very unlikely to vote for Obama in November, and you've said you're very likely to vote for him. Why are you likely to vote to reelect him?
I am likely to vote for Obama partly because of who the alternative is likely to be, and mostly because at this point, on a national level at least, I'm a functional Democrat. I mean, it's not actually enormously complicated. Am I happy with everything he's done? No. Do I think he's been a great president? No. But I was pretty skeptical of him when I voted for him the first time.
Right.
I described myself as the head of Obama skeptics for Obama,
right.
And I would still call myself that. And I would like to see. I just can't think of anything that the other side's going to say that's going to make me say, no, actually these guys deserve a turn at this point.
That makes sense to me. I would say I certainly am not.
And if I were an ideological libertarian, or if I were an ideological paleocon, right, I could understand voting for Gary Johnson or whoever runs on the Constitution Party line or whatever. Like if that's who I were, but I'm not one of these sorts of people. So
yeah. Gary Johnson is almost certainly who I'll vote for. I guess Mitt Romney could plausibly persuade me, maybe. Rick Santorum, there's no way he could persuade me to vote for him. And Newt Gingrich would tempt me to vote for Obama because I'm so terrified of the prospect of him being president. But it looks like he's thankfully going to lose in the primaries. I guess I supported Obama in 2008, thinking he was going to govern in accordance with his rhetoric on civil liberties, and or at least a lot closer than he has. And for me, it's just a matter. I can't bring myself to vote for someone who has done some of the extreme things that he's done.
Yeah, and I respect that enormously. I mean, Obama has represented in, with respect to the things that you were most pissed off about from the Bush administration, his foreign policy and his record on civil liberties, he's represented more continuity than not. In the civil liberty side, he's entrenched basically all of the things that Bush innovated, and in a couple of cases exceeded them. And on the foreign policy front, there's been a real change in emphasis, which is what he ran on, but in very broad strokes, he didn't. I'm less surprised at what's happened on the foreign policy side. Because he ran on a change in emphasis rather than a radical change in direction, and that's what he's delivered.
I think that's mostly right. Well,
we should probably wrap up.
Yeah, we should wrap up. It's been fun, and we'll do it again sometime. I hope.
I look forward to it.
All right.